I'm going to open with a quote from Gadamer. Quote, "So when it comes to art, it is meaningless to ask the artist what he or she meant. Likewise, it is meaningless to ask the perceiver what the work really says to him or her. Both of these matters go far beyond the subjective awareness of one or the other." End quote. It challenges some of the most basic concepts of ethnomusicology, and also I think it challenges most people's conceptions of hermeneutics, a term which is often used to describe the interpretation of an author or artist's intent, meaning their meaning behind the work. Phenomenological hermeneutics, the tradition in which I'm working, and which comes from Heidegger, Gadamer, and Ricoeur, departs from the simple act of translation via commitment to the ineluctability of interpretation for all human awareness. Description is always already an interpretation. It also reminds us that both music and culture are temporal activities done by individuals unaware of all the power relations at work upon them. Both these are constantly moving targets situated within a field that we can never fully observe from the outside. Improvisation in music, as well as in everyday activities of life, heightens our awareness of that problem, of a lack of perspective. It's an act of creation that relies on the here and now, but one that would be meaningless and impossible without a shared symbolic schema. Meaningful, spontaneous conversations, for example, require deep understandings not only of linguistic grammar, but also poetic nuance of bodily language enacted at the level of habit. We seldom think about grammatical rules that govern statements during a conversation. This is also the case with the knowledge of harmony needed to realize a figured bass or effectively solo over chord changes, or even work in a utopic concept of free improvisation as well. So that complicates traditional Western musicology, whose traditional object of study is the score, not the performance. Improvisation does. Yet the attention towards improvisation here is directly challenged by Gadamer's quote. How are we to understand music that might never be repeated or even be repeatable without asking the musicians or the listeners what they thought? Going directly, I think, from some of Ritvik's challenges here, which I found as well as an ethnographer too. Improvisation illuminates Gadamer's notion of play as the ontology of the art. With a hermeneutic ontology in place, improvisation becomes an invitation to consider the importance of imagination in the maintenance of our self-identity. Through the ideas of Paul Ricoeur, I suggest that listening and following are keys to understanding empathy and solicitude in the maintenance of our self-identity. Hermeneutics problematizes aestheicization that would render music as completely autonomous or wholly contingent. Instead, it turns the analysis towards the possible negotiations of self and others. And it's that potential and that possible that I want to get at. I'm going to really just skim through this part on Werktreue. So that's the traditional musicology will place the emphasis on the objectivity and the truth value of a work on its score. And so this idea that the work is true, which of course is non-existent for improvisation. I mean, what's the score? The person's life. But we want to also be careful, I think, of social Werktreue, where we place the objective knowledge of understanding just on the social compartment and the interactions amongst the musicians. I think that doesn't take us any further than relying on a score. The sociality becomes a score that could be read and interpreted, which becomes just asking people what they thought, which goes beyond the subjectivity. So improvisation then, but from the perspective of the audience, is in fact a work in the Werk, right, Werktreue. The presence or absence of a score does not determine the meaning of a work when it is experienced. This was a question I was going to ask to Harry. The fact that we listen to improvisations and that we find them meaningful reveals the ontological problem with Werktreue, both social and regular flavor. Truth, at least in art, is not the product of adequation. This is a lesson not only for improvisation, but for all music. And it's not just a lesson for all music, but for our ability to experience subjective and intersubjective human truths. If we keep music in a separate aesthetic sphere, it's rendered meaningless or merely formal. If we collapse the aesthetic into the social, music can only mirror or echo its social settings. It's necessary to take into consideration the interpretive gap opened through listening. That's why I want to turn to Gadamer's play. Music experiences of all kinds present us with a very clear example of Gadamer's concept of play as the ontology of the work of art. Play here doesn't refer to the act of sounding one's instrument. Rather, it is the medial and temporal quality of the experience of art. He suggests play as an insight into the dire seriousness of art that has the potential to completely transform the player even if the play happens to be fun or even better, pleasurable. To play is to lose oneself in the game, and thus subjectivity is no longer in charge of what happens to people in the experience. Rather, we surrender ourselves to the game. Playing the game means respecting the rules or the essential given. Thus, the work of art is always and necessarily an unfolding, like a conversation, like a meaningful conversation. A meaningful conversation comes with a request, or at least the potential to change your position. So does play. Also, like a conversation, play is never one-sided. If we are to experience it fully, it demands our response. Gadamer defines play as, quote, a process that takes place in between. Play does not have its being in the player's consciousness or attitude, but on the contrary, play draws him into its dominion and fills him with its spirit. The player experiences the game as a reality that surpasses him, end quote. And the gendered language is Gadamer's in Truth and Method. These ideas seem ready-made to describe music and even more so improvisation. If we switch for a moment from improvisation and just think about performers playing a composed piece, it helps me to understand play. The performers and the audience, if they are truly listening, are engaged in a game whose rules are created by the composer. The work unfolds in time as the notes sound and the structure is revealed through the course of the performance. The piece exists finally only in our memory, and this is a short memory. This is a clear enough example of the work being brought to presentation. If we now imagine performers freely improvising with no pre-composed themes, they're playing a game whose rules are dictated from each other, or if one of them happens to be a robot. Each sound is an invitation to respond, and that response can be anything, sound or silence, acknowledgement or ignorance, and that anything then becomes the dictate for the game to proceed until the performers collectively devise the rules for ending the game. This improvisational bringing to presentation is perhaps more difficult to imagine when we shift our focus back to the listeners, the audience, which I emphasize is the locus for the consideration to how art has a social impact. The tarrying occurs between the work and the listener. The listener needs to play along to follow the performance. Which aspects of the sound become decisive or important in the unfolding of the performance? Which aspects are less important or even incidental? A listener follows along with the improvisation, catching the calls and responses of the performers, which may or may not be evident to the performers themselves, like if one happens to be sleeping. Ultimately, the form of the piece is realized only in the memory of its unfolding in its entirety. This constant process of deliberation are the rules of the game, the mediation of the piece as a meaningful experience. This is why I can say improvisation and composition here are identical. Both are brought to presentation through play between the sounding of the work and the listener. The process of paying attention follows and following along with the sounds of being played by the play is the same, regardless of if the music has been composed in advance or is being composed spontaneously. It's still following along. The fact that in improvisation the composing occurs simultaneously with the work being brought to presentation is not an exception for play, but rather reveals play's natural and expected temporality. All art is contemporaneous with its play. In the case of fixed artistic forms like a painting or a composed piece of music, every experience with the work is a renewal of its meaning rather than a reliving of the moment of its now historical creation. Even the belief that we are reliving the experience, as in the case of nostalgia, is in fact new since time has passed and we have changed. Improvisation discloses that the moment of play is decisive. What improvisation can learn from pre-composed works is that the ability to continually return to works reveals the inexhaustible surplus of meaning that works hold. This surplus of meaning is still present in improvisation, but it's harder to locate because at the limit, improvisational works might not be repeated, especially if they're not recorded. Perhaps even in the case of radically freely improvised music, we can find a similar repeatability, but I think it's transposed onto the level of genre, now thought of as a tradition at work within specific communities rather than the marketing term that I think most of us would immediately go to with genre. So, on the other hand, the temporality of play reminds us that no work is ever really replicated, no matter how fixed or improvised it is. Every work is made new in each experience of it. The historicity of works is brought into the experience from the side of the work, but it, just like subjectivity, can never have the final say or the determinative role in the conversation. The structuring experience itself is set against a horizon in that it is temporal. Both the listener and the work are transformed by the experience. Gadamer characterizes this as a fusion of horizons that occurs between the horizon of the work and the horizon of the listener. The fusion of horizon provides us with a hermeneutic autonomy for art as a transcendence within immanence. The within immanence here is important. The neo-Kantian conception of aesthetic distinction would render art totally separate from reality. Gadamer's fusion of horizons radicalizes that, and it accounts for the ability of art to transform us, to change us, and reminds us, though, that that transformation is rooted in our own experiences as listeners, but also in the historicity of the work itself. Even in the case of radically improvised music, that historicity may be hard to find. Just as we cannot play or enjoy a game with unfamiliar rules, so too do our prejudices affect our experience of art. Prejudice here refers to our familiarity with the rules of the game of play. This includes the concept of historicity of the work or its genre. We need to have some understanding of how the music is supposed to unfold for us to recognize it as music in the first place. However, those prejudices, both on the side of the work and the side of the listener, are never final because the experience itself calls the prejudices into question and offers the potential for transformation. Gadamer proposes, quote, "In fact, all artistic creation challenges each of us to listen to the language in which the work of art speaks and to make it our own," end quote. So the language here is one that arises in the experience of art, and as art, it is an experience that is open to everyone, and this might immediately recall a kind of worn-out metaphor that music is a universal language. But what Gadamer is suggesting here is that the language in which a work speaks arises only and uniquely through the experience of it, contains a surfeit of meaning, and exists only to transform its speaker, and listener would be identical there, and is wholly symbolic and metaphoric. So it isn't music as a universal language, it's more like language as a universal music. Perhaps the other way makes more sense. So it's not just the prejudice that are transfigured, but the worlds of both the listener and the work, hence fusion of horizon. Gadamer notes, quote, "This means that in any encounter with art, it is not particular, but rather the totality of the experienceable world, man's ontological place in it, and above all, his finitude before that which transcends him, that is brought to experience," end quote. Art can shake us to our very core, yet it is an inexhaustible experience in which we find ourselves. This leads us away from indexical references within the work and towards an ontological concept of symbol itself. Gadamer writes, quote, "The symbolic does not simply point toward a meaning, but rather allows that meaning to present itself. And moreover, quote, the work of art does not simply refer to something because what it refers to is actually there. We could say the work of art signifies an increase in being," end quote. He characterizes that increase in being as mimesis, by which he doesn't mean servile imitation of something, but the symbolic action of the work itself in superabundance. Or we could say that the work exemplifies what the work is about. Which brings me to listening and shifting to Paul Ricoeur. Ricoeur also uses the term mimesis to construe the process of how works become meaningful. He suggests thinking of mimesis in three parts, depicting a movement from the prefigured world to configuration, in which we confront the world of work, and culminating in a refiguration of our world. The idea of a prefigured world corresponds to Gadamer's notion of prejudice. We cannot simply enter into play without some anchorage in the practical world, and we intellectually belong to history. Even in radically experimental improvised music, the expression of freedom is grounded in a pre-understanding of what is acceptable. Our familiarity with the rules of the game in what Ricoeur's Mimesis 1 allows us to recognize our familiarity with the rules of the game and what Ricoeur calls Mimesis 1 allows us to recognize the injunction issued from a work that draws us into the transformative event. The configuration that occurs then in Mimesis 2 suspends or brackets the prefigured world. Entering the world of the work allows us to raise questions about the modality of our being in the world. Accounting for the shared ontology of all music, even if they stem from different historical traditions, or I can also say that they come from different worlds, now opens up the possibility for those different worlds to be transformed. Turning our attention towards the entire process of mimesis further guards against aestheticism. The experience of art is always transformative when carried through all three stages. Aestheticism relegates the experience to only one stage. Prefigured stage, if the art serves only to correspond its prefigured correspond to its prefigured rules, or perhaps in mimesis 2, if the experience is wholly transcendent and escapist, it has no anchorage in mimesis 1 and it has no application on the other side. Ricoeur's concept helps explain the concept of transcendence within immanence that characterizes this hermeneutic autonomy. What is really at stake in the transformative moment is not just genre or tradition, but our sense of the world in its entirety. The experience of art gives us a world in which to live and is not merely an aesthetic object devoid of culture. The world it gives us allows for and even calls for change and transformation. This argument comes in part from a rethinking of Kant's critique of judgment via Gadamer and Ricoeur, and particularly Hannah Arendt. So Kant grounds taste in sensus communis, common sense, or better, sense in common, explaining that the reason why aesthetic judgments, which explains why the reason aesthetic judgments are made as if they're universal. Arendt finds the as if here to resound in political judgments as well. To find the echoes of aesthetic judgment in the political sphere is not to say that there is no difference between the experience of art and the experience of politics, but rather that the experience of art gives us insight into the kinds of judgments that need to be done as politics. And for Arendt and me as well, politics here refers to our ability to act in consort, and thus is closer to what could also be referred to as the social, acting for and with others in our public life. Both aesthetics and politics require phronesis, or prudential wisdom, through reflective judgment in which the universal is sought that applies to the specific, as opposed to determinative judgment in which the specific is subsumed under the given universal. For Kant, only the latter was cognitive. Arendt suggests that the concepts of exemplarity, which Kant finds central to aesthetic judgment, provides insight into the imagination required for political life. Thus, the sense in common that arises through a transformative event can be thought of as a summoning of a community. Gadamer, responding specifically to the challenge of modern experimental art, he's actually writing about Duchamp here, writes, quote, the artist no longer speaks for the community, but forms his own community insofar as he expresses himself. Nevertheless, he does create a community, and in principle, this truly universal community, ecumen, extends to the whole world. End quote. Even works that challenge their own history issue a call to joy in their world. Radical art is not the exception to this, but rather it heightens our awareness of the communicative power of the experience. It is the refigured, enlarged reality that has learned and continues to learn from improvised music that summons the communities as individuals to heed the call of exemplary works. The call is open to anyone prepared to hear it, and thus the ecumene is essentially open, and to engage in it is to cultivate oneself or to experience Bildung, the particularly poetic and effective term Gadamer uses to describe culture. Specifically, improvisation stresses the importance of openness and adaptability because those aspects are given precedence in the experience. That these concepts are not just political but moral reminds us of the ontological depth of the imagination signaled by the as if. As Roger Savage puts it, quote, like the injunction that issues from the example of a singular moral act, the suitability of the world that is expressed by a work testifies to a possible modality of inhabiting the world, end quote. The exemplarity of the moral act is the apprehension of the fit between the act and the situation to which it answers. The music sustains and informs the community just as the community sustains and supports the music. Its communicability is the followability that arises from grasping the fit between the work and the world. Improvisation, then, as a technique, specifically emphasizes a component of passivity to the experience of art. Passivity is ontologically here already part of every aesthetic experience, corresponding to our willingness to submit fully to a transformative experience. But music draws this out further because of its unique capacity to refigure our sense of time. It seems paradoxical to argue that music, so often associated with radical freedom, as is the case of free jazz, is bound together with dependence or passivity, but I think that the paradox is in fact productive in coming to understand exactly what is exemplified as free in this music and how that affects our identity. Improvisation, in emphasizing listening both from the performers and from the audience, stresses the importance of passivity in freedom. Bobby Bradford, a senior figure in improvised music in Los Angeles, explained the difference between conventional jazz and the music he and his peers, which includes the noted saxophonist Ornette Coleman, as saying, quote, "You are free to play anything that is musically responsible." The pause there is always the exact amount of time, impossible to type. that is musically responsible. Freedom tempered by responsibility after the precisely perfect time span of contemplation. That responsibility is raised to the fore in improvised music because it becomes a demonstration of responsibility to and for others. Listening in improvised music is not just responding or yielding, but also knowing when to take the lead. The sense of responsibility that Bradford highlights becomes about the same imaginative acts needed in negotiating our identity as being with and even for others. All art allows for this exercise of imagination, but improvisation draws it to the fore and risks its very status as art to do so, because of the Werktrue concept, rather than rushing directly to the musician's responsibilities to each other or to the performance as a demonstration of ethics, which would cut off the autonomy of the music and reduce it to a communication of a particular, albeit very important, ethical lesson. Instead, Mamesa suggests that we submit the experience improvisation engenders to our productive imagination. The capacity to imagine offers us new understandings of our entire world. Our willingness to suspend our pre-understandings to fully participate in the experience of the art provides us insight into what happens in the conversations with other people, which always present us with a risk precisely because to genuinely converse means to transform our narrative identity, which is very much the problem I think that Ritwik is facing in passive aggressiveness sometimes. The risk, we're free to risk in music, but we might not be so safe to risk personally with people who we might offend. I have like one more sentence. The risk, it's a really long sentence though. The risk should also remind us of the potential danger involved in manipulating our identities. The fusion of horizon does not exempt aesthetic experience from ideological distortions. And in fact, given the importance Gadamer places on prejudice, his ideas help explain precisely why propaganda works. Yet it's precisely the productive imagination that can allow us to wrest personal interpretive power back and imagine the world differently. That power is occluded by aestheticism that treats art as either distracting from ideology or as correlative to the social. In order for art to be transformative, in order for the experience to have power in terms of our identity, it needs to have critical distance. Instead of talking about the meaning of art, hermeneutics proposes possible meanings and potential interpretations. What new social worlds can be built on these possibilities?